This program will be in English because I am going to interview Gilbert Doctorow. He is an American. He's based in Brussels, and he is an international political scientist. As we know, Brussels is the capital of the European Union and of NATO. Mr. Doctorow, good day. We see you now also. A popular Dutch journalist wrote in 2014 the following. His name is Geert Mak. Russia is on the move again. After the collapse of the Soviet Empire, it wants to start making history once more. And how? Old myths about Russian greatness and the Russian soul are being dusted off, borders are being redrawn, spheres of influence determined by force. It is as if we are back in the 19th century, complete with rigid and short-sighted Tsarism. Russians have a sense that the Western world, including Western values and Western ways of thinking, are no longer paramount. Implicitly, this journalist tries to convey the message that Russia is not entitled to make history because only the United States is allowed to do so, and also that we are speaking about an inferior culture, an inferior country. As you are a expert on the relations between Russia and the West, and already for more than a quarter of a century, what is your reaction to a vision like the one Geert Mak tries to convey?
Well, I'd like to deal with two aspects of your question. The first is, in what sense am I an expert? And then we come back to his question of what Russia is doing today, about its self-image, about its conduct on the world stage, and to whom is the notion of grandeur or historical presence important in Russia today. I begin with the definition of expertise. Yes, I am an expert on Russia, and it is an expertise that is based in book learning, because I do hold a doctorate in Russian history going back to the 1970s. That's a long time ago. In the meantime, I've done many other things with my life. I've spent 10 years working as a corporate manager, general manager for Russian operations of some very major international corporations. So I want to stress that my view on Russia is a composite view, one that is grounded in book learning, but has been largely fleshed out up to the very present by my travels there, by the people I speak to, and by my interchange with ongoing and living Russian culture. In that sense, I feel that I have a first-person singular that I bring to my works. My last book, this book about Does the United States Have a Future, has much of it written in the first person, because I'm describing my personal experience in Russia, on the Russian domestic television and so forth. And that is the insight that I bring to answer the question that you posed. The question assumed that Russia has an aggressive intention, that is a revisionist state, that is writing the new rules, that is expanding at its borders. This is the problem of our day. It is a remark made by someone who has no knowledge of Russia in the first person, who is speaking abstractly and is mostly looking in the mirror when he thinks about what Russia could or should be. He's not looking at Russia. And that is a tragedy of our times. Very few people, very few experts are speaking from first-hand knowledge and are speaking about the Russia that you can see and not the Russian that we can imagine. Russia is not trying to expand its borders. What happened in Ukraine, and particularly what happened in Crimea, was an exceptional situation which was imposed on Russia. And if there is a merit in what I am writing, it is to try to delineate very clearly cause and effect. Almost all of our media speak about the effect part. They look at what Russia is saying or what they think Russia is doing, and they're not asking, why are they doing this? Why are they saying this? Russia's behavior is largely explained by our behavior, by the way we have been trying to contain Russia and to demean Russia and to deny its importance as a factor in our culture and in our common civilization.
I want to speak about that because the West now is trying to a new cordon sanitaire to isolate Russia and to isolate it from the world community, more or less. Are they succeeding in this, the Western powers?
Yes, you're very correct. Cordon sanitaire is very much what is the practice, although that lovely French expression has disappeared from common use. It is a fine description of what the West is imposing by its behavior in the sports world, for example, by this whole scandal over Russian participation in the Olympics, by the now pending withdrawal of the UK from the football championships in Russia. These are all symptomatic of a policy of isolation, of containment, of opprobrium, of making Russia appear to be a pariah state. When you take a country that's in the top 10 world economies, that is one of the most prolific contributors to world culture, was in the past and is today, when it has one of the world's most efficient and professional diplomatic corps, when it is the rival and in some respects at perfect parity with the United States in global strategic weapons and security means, it is foolish and impractical and counterproductive to think that you can isolate that country. The impact, the likely consequence of the speech which Vladimir Putin delivered to the Federal Assembly, that is the two houses of the Russian parliament, last week on the 1st of March, that was one more act by the Russian state in a process that is leading to the inclusion of larger and larger numbers of states in the Russian camp. There was no Russian camp, and Russia did not pretend to have anything resembling a camp in the sense of the Soviet Union had a camp, a socialist camp opposed to the so-called free world of market-dominated economies. There's nothing of the sort today, but Russia is forming a group of sympathizing and adherent countries, which last week Mr. Putin gave a very strong argument to promote. That is to say, he extended a nuclear umbrella over countries that are called Russia's allies. I think it is reasonable to expect in the coming half a year to a year that there will be a long line of countries that we used to call third world, or then we called developing countries, that will be lined up at the Kremlin's door to get in under that umbrella, since it will save them from the bullying and the one-sided dealing that the United States has had with all these countries when there was no challenger for their allegiance and as there is today.
Now, about the pressure which is focused on Russia, the Russian Federation, I have to say, to keep the internal cohesion, elites always need an external threat. That's an old-fashioned European dogma. It was transported also to the United States by German ideologues, as you know. This is important in the view of the rising populism in the United States, of which you also speak in your book, Does the United States Have a Future? Now, I want to quote Mr. Kissinger, former U.S. Secretary of Foreign Affairs. He stated in 2015, and I quote, "Breaking Russia has become an objective. The long-range purpose should be to integrate it." That was the official politics under President Obama, to break Russia, because he said it in 2015. Why would the elites in the United States would favor a breakup of Russia and knowing that it will end in total chaos, like the Middle East has become total chaos, like the Maghreb, the northern part of Africa where the Arabs live, is becoming an enormous chaos. Why would the elites provoke so much chaos in Russia?
Well, I think that the crossroad where that was thinkable was passed 18 years ago. The breakup of Russia is impossible. It was possible, it was thinkable in 1998 and 1999. When Putin came to power, he was very well aware of the potential Balkanization or Yugoslav scenario on the territory of the Russian Federation. And this is why he imposed the famous vertical of power to reestablish central control over that vast country of 11 time zones, which does not admit a very substantial self-administration, and certainly does not admit a very much regional autonomy, regional, self-governance, because that can only lead to chaos at the federal level. What Putin has succeeded in doing, not only by administrative measures, by restoring the means of control, but by restoring a national economy, by restoring a national interest in social welfare, is that he has saved Russia from any such schemes or designs that may have at a certain time been harbored within the United States. You say, why would they look for chaos? Well, they look for chaos in Russia for the same reasons that certain American elites have looked for chaos in the Middle East. It strengthens the American control over all of its allies. It confirms and reconsolidates and makes seemingly invincible the global hegemony of the United States. However, all that has reached a point of where we are approaching the moment of truth. And I think that Putin's speech last week was, in a sense, presenting to the United States that moment of truth. Namely, that these aspirations to contain, create a cordon sanitaire around, or hopefully to break up the great Russian Federation, have created as a result a strengthened Russia, a refortified Russia, and a rearmed Russia, which is now fully the peer of the United States in strategic weaponry. And this was so powerful, although it was denied immediately by many Western commentators in Europe, in the United States, who liked to believe initially that Putin was bluffing, although the man is most serious. He is not a card player. He is a very cautious man, and was announcing publicly what is well in hand. This weaponry which turns the United States cordon around Russia, its ABM global anti-ballistic missile system, into a new Maginot Line. This was eventually penetrating even the thick skulls of my compatriots who occupy important and prestigious positions in Washington, D.C. And the telling factor that what he said was true, and that the potential removal of the United States from its podium as the sole and unchallenged ruler of the world is occurring in front of our eyes. That was witnessed by something which your listeners would not be aware of, and which I would like to bring to their attention at this moment. The letter of 4 United States senators that was issued on the 8th of March to Rex Tillerson, the U.S. Secretary of State, calling upon him to reopen arms control talks with the Kremlin as soon as possible. I say that your readership, your listenership, would not be aware of this because there has been zero press coverage of this letter since March 8th.
So
4 days have gone
why
by,
is that?
a single mainstream media outlet in the United States or in Europe has mentioned this. What we have is the most extraordinary case of black holes, of self-censorship, and of withholding in very important information from the broad American public and European publics. Who are these four senators? Two of them have been among the biggest voices in denouncing Trump, in furthering the Mueller investigation into what they allege were complicity between Trump and the Russians and the Kremlin. That is to say, they have been using the charges of Russiagate as a cudgel against Trump in their Russophobic denunciations. These two senators, that is Senator Dianne Feinberg of California and Senator Bernie Sanders, who is probably a more familiar name to your audience, they both were leaders in calling for a review and a change of line in the United States policy to Russia. They mentioned at the end of their letter, with some nostalgia, the constructive talks that were held between Russia and between the United States and the Soviet Union from the time of Khrushchev through 2002, and which culminated in a whole series of important documents, important conventions restricting and reducing nuclear weapons, and reducing the threat of an Armageddon. This is a sea change. They are all Democrats. Well, though you can say Bernie Sanders is officially an independent, but they are among the most severe critics of the approach that Donald Trump intended from the day he took office, which was to conduct civilized diplomatic talks with the Russians to lessen the tensions and to bring us back from the abyss.
So, can you elaborate a little bit more on the ABM treaty, which wanted to stop the possibility of Russia to hit back? Because if the Americans were allowed again to use missiles to shoot out of the air the reaction of the Russians, their own missiles, there would not be any parity anymore. So the Russians, not only are they threatened by the eastward movement of the NATO bases, but also by nuclear first strike of the United States. So can you elaborate a little bit more on this treaty?
Well, just one step back. The ABM, the anti-ballistic missile bases, are not merely a defensive tool of the United States to prevent a riposte response from Russia in case the United States staged an attack first. They are also potentially within 10, 15, 20-minute change over time. The launchers are capable of offensive cruise missile launch. Therefore, the two are compatible. The Russians were faced by both a potential violation by the United States of the intermediate and short-range missile convention that is still in force, by making these defensive bases interoperable as offensive bases. But they were confronted by the proliferation of American anti-ballistic missile capabilities at sea around the coastlines of Russia in the north and the south. This was a very big threat. Now, the treaty that we're talking about, the ABM treaty, was signed by Nixon and by Brezhnev in 1972. It had a 30-year life. It could have been extended indefinitely, but it was the decision of the Bush administration to go for it. That is, to put away all constraints that had kept the peace by ensuring a parity of destruction, the so-called mutually assured destruction, or MAD acronym, that had kept the peace for 40 years. Since Russia was flat on its back in the 1990s, since Russia seemed to be incapable of defending itself, of projecting power abroad, the United States decided that the time had come to dispense with all of these restraints and constraints and to go for it, to go for global hegemony in a way that no one possibly could recover from. That was a miscalculation. The miscalculation was that Russia was finished once and for all and didn't have to be reckoned with. So the United States decided to use its superior technology and its lack of inhibition and constraint from the now scrapped ABM Treaty to develop a global anti-ballistic missile program and to further its forces, both conventional and nuclear, virtually to the borders of the Russian Federation. That's where we were until March 1st, 2018, when President Putin unveiled the answer measures, the response measures, which go back in time to the abrogation of the ABM Treaty unilaterally by the United States in 2002. So what, if anyone in Western media are paying attention to Putin's speech, and the one-third of it that was military oriented last week, they speak about this as if it came out of nowhere. It's something we didn't suspect, something that the Russians have furtively developed. There was nothing furtive about it. Putin made repeated mention over the last 14 years that the American attempt to achieve strategic superiority and to dictate to the world, including to Russia, from a position of strength was no longer valid. That global hegemony was coming to a very quick end because it no longer had military support under it.
So billions of dollars have been misspent in a way because the United States thought that they would be the bosses of the world with these new weapons. But because of Russia, there is parity, at least parity again. So spending all this money on something which is at least outdated, what does this mean for the future of the United States?
Well, we haven't yet learned the lesson. That's to say, it is entirely possible, if not even probable, that the U.S. reaction to what Putin unveiled last week will be to double down and to persist and to expand further the expenditures on the military in order to bridge the gap, to catch up with the Russians. Putin also said that this is technically not possible. It's taken the Russians 14 years to achieve the technical breakthroughs that were just on display and which were being explained by Putin last week. The United States will not bridge that gap in 1, 2, 3. You can see that the Russians will maintain a decade lead on the United States in these offensive weapons for the foreseeable future. So what we have is the prospect of vast new expenditures that will be equally unproductive and will not close the gap. The question of the hardship for American taxpayers or for generations 1 or 2 down the line, that is to say, our progeny, our children and our grandchildren, who will find this national debt on their shoulders, that's the least of it. The bigger issue is, will the United States begin to behave responsibly? Our behavior has been swashbuckling. We have assumed that the Russians were helpless and could inevitably see reason and do as we say. Do as we say by giving back the Crimea. Do as we say by allowing Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. Do as we say in everything of vital importance to Russia's own security interests. That's not going to happen. On the contrary, Russian behavior is becoming more self-assured by the day now that Putin has dropped this information bomb on the United States and the world at large. So the question is, are the United States going to behave responsibly and draw back from its very provocative and derogatory and insulting behavior towards Russia of the last several years? Or is the United States going to grow up, or are we going to have still more dramatic confrontations with Russia before this sorts itself out and international affairs can return to normal?
And in the meantime, Europe is in danger, more or less, because if the United States doesn't accept the conditions in which we live right now, and a stronger Russia, and there is a war, then Europe will be on the front line.
No, I don't agree with you about
No?
that. I think that Washington, D.C. is on the front line. And this is a point that also comes out of Vladimir Putin's speech. The weaponry that he described, including Mach 10 and Mach 20 missiles, cruise missiles, that changes the game entirely and puts substance under the policy positions that Vladimir Putin announced several years ago. He said, but our media have pretended not to hear it, that any attack on the Russian Federation coming from Europe would result in a Russian attack on the U.S. homeland. Mark my words, on the U.S. homeland. Putin is treating Europe as a vassal of the United States and not as a self-governing entity. As far as Russia is concerned, the whole of Europe has no sovereignty. Please mark those words. In some respects, this should give European leaders and European publics a great deal of quiet satisfaction. An attack on Russia coming from Poland may result in a Russian attack on Poland, but not on Brussels. It will result in a Russian attack on Washington, D.C.
Now we don't know this. This is the American elites and the press, the mainstream press. Why do they still act as if they are autistic, if they are not able to hear the sounds coming from another direction? Why is this?
The astonishing fact, which we see today, that is the failure of all media, all mainstream media in the States and Europe, to acknowledge that letter of the 8th of March by 4 senators who became non-persons. Senators became non-persons when they crossed the line of political correctness and said, we have to speak to the Russians now. Now, what is going on? Why are people so stubborn, so mulish, and so blind as to miss what's going on? Because they cannot comprehend it. It does not correspond to what they have led themselves to believe. I used to work in Yugoslavia, and my Yugoslav friends, when there was once a Yugoslavia in the 1980s still, they had wonderful senses of humor, to the extent of political jokes that left is right and right is wrong, or the remark that it's fine to fool the other guy, but just beware when your propaganda fools you. And this is exactly what's happened in the States. We have lost, the United States has lost its intelligence capabilities with respect to Russia. It is not following the ball. They are not looking at the Russia that exists. They are looking at a Russia that they have invented for their own internal debates. Therefore, when a Russia that exists comes forward and gives them something which should shake people out of their stupor, they are still slow to respond. I call attention to one more fact, which I omitted when I described who those senators were who signed this letter. Dianne Feinberg is not just any senator. She has been the longest-serving member of the Senate Intelligence Committee. For the period of 2009 to 2015, she was the chairwoman of that committee. If anybody knows what U.S. intelligence does or does not know, about Russia's military capabilities, it was Diane Feinberg. And I think it's very telling and very significant that she has been one of the first movers, because she is one of the few people who understood the complete hopelessness of U.S. intelligence on Russia.
Why is that? I wondered also, and you wrote about it, why is it that the American intelligence was not able to foresee what the Russians would do?
First of all, it starts with a general mindset that cuts across all the American elites. They all are caught in a time warp. They are all have the Russia that they want, the Russia of the 1990s, of a drunken President Yeltsin, who was at their beck and call. They all have the Russia that is described by Bill Clinton's close associate in the book called The Russia Hand, the Russia that was giving the lines for Yeltsin to read, the Russia that had a president installed at the control of Washington's NGOs and political advisors. They are not looking at the Russia of 2018, which is a very different Russia. They cannot, they also have lost the expertise. After 9/11, there was a very big shakeup in CIA and other of the 17 U.S. intelligence agencies. These had at their core experts who had been trained at the Soviet desk. The Soviet Union was the #1 security issue for decades in the minds of Americans, and therefore you had Soviet studies programs, you had language programs teaching Russian and other languages of the Soviet Union, and you had development of experts who were then recruited into the CIA and other agencies. In 2001, many of the senior officers in the CIA were, by professional training, Soviet desk people. They were all given furlough. They all were sent away. There was a purge of these agencies to bring up to date the expertise that the United States at that moment, after 9/11, decided was relevant to its future security needs, namely Arabists, Farsi specialists, Middle East specialists. And because those people cannot be trained or brought in very quickly, much of the intelligence work from that period, from 2003, 2004, was outsourced to private enterprises. That is to say, the United States government lost a great deal of its expertise in Russia at around that time. And it never regained it because up to 70% of the entire U.S. budget for intelligence has been outsourced. It is outsourcing to private companies is much easier when they use public sources, open sources. The people who are working in these intelligence agencies do not needed security clearances. Those who are working in the private companies providing U.S. intelligence do not need security clearances. Therefore, a great deal, up to 90% of U.S. intelligence is presently produced from open sources. Need I tell you how much open sources are going to tell you about Russia's military developments? This is the reason why the United States, in its hubris, has been flying blind with respect to Russia and the world at large.
And it's highly dangerous. You are leaving, we have to finish because the studio is occupied by other people. You are leaving for Moscow the coming week. When you return, would you be kind enough to again be interviewed about these subjects?
Well, I'll be very pleased, and I hope that I will bring back from that current trip to Russia also some relevant remarks. Again, in the first person singular, from my own experience, and not from what I've read in the newspapers.
Right.
I'm going I'm going to Russia as an international observer of the presidential elections within an NGO that reports to the Council of Europe.
Well, have a good stay in Russia, and I advise the readers, or not readers so much as the viewers, to read this book, Does the United States Have a Future? Collected non-conformist essays on Russian-American relations 2015 to 2017. I highly recommend this book because you get a total different view of our neighbor Russia. Thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.